Dad, what did you do to that child?
I don't know what you are talking about.
Marcus Bennett had everything money could buy. A mansion worth millions, a business empire spanning continents, and twin sons he would have given his entire fortune to see walk. What he didn't have was trust. So when he came home early that Thursday afternoon and heard laughter echoing through the marble hallways, he stopped cold. The sounds were coming from the children's playroom. His paralyzed sons, who weren't supposed to be able to move their legs, were making sounds he'd never heard before. And then he saw her, the black maid he'd hired 6 months ago, on her knees on the polished floor, doing something that would either destroy her life or change everything he thought he knew about the world.
Grace Okafor had cleaned houses since she was 16 years old. Now, at 34, her knees ached every night, her hands bore the permanent chemical burns of bleach and ammonia, and her bank account held exactly $843, savings she'd been building for 7 years to bring her mother over from Nigeria. She'd learned long ago that in wealthy white homes, invisibility was survival. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. Become part of the furniture, the wallpaper, the fixtures that made their lives comfortable while remaining utterly forgettable. The Bennett Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut was her biggest assignment yet. 23 rooms spread across 11,000 square feet of marble, mahogany, and money. Marcus Bennett, the owner, had made his fortune in pharmaceutical investments, the kind of wealth that insulated you from the problems ordinary people faced. His wife, Victoria, had died 2 years earlier in a car accident, leaving him to raise their twin sons alone. Well, not alone. He had nannies, tutors, physical therapists, and Grace. The boys, Ethan and Lucas, were 5 years old and had been born with a rare neurological condition that left them paralyzed from the waist down. Grace had been hired specifically to maintain the ground floor where the children lived, their bedrooms, the medical equipment room, the massive playroom with its specialized furniture and therapeutic toys. She'd been told explicitly by Mr. Bennett during her interview, "The children are not your concern. You clean around them. You do not engage with them. I have medical professionals for that." She'd nodded, smiled the smile she'd perfected over 18 years of domestic work, and said, "Yes, sir, I understand completely." But understanding and agreeing were two different things. The first time she'd seen the boys, they'd been sitting in their specialized wheelchairs in the playroom, staring at a television screen showing a cartoon neither seemed interested in. The physical therapist, a stern woman named Karen with tight lips and tighter schedules, had been on her phone in the corner, barely watching them. Grace had entered quietly to clean the windows, and Lucas, the younger twin by 3 minutes, had turned his head toward her. "You're new," he had said. Grace had frozen, cloth in hand, remembering Mr. Bennett's instructions. "She's the cleaning lady, Lucas. She's not here to talk," Karen had said without looking up from her phone. Grace had smiled politely at the boy, then turned back to the windows, her heart squeezing at the loneliness she'd seen in his eyes. That look, she knew it. It was the same look her younger brother had worn in Lagos when the other children wouldn't play with him because his clothes were too worn, his shoes too old. Over the following weeks, Grace learned the patterns of the Bennett household. Mr. Bennett left at 6:30 each morning, sometimes earlier, and rarely returned before 8 at night. The nannies worked in shifts but spent most of their time on their phones or talking to each other in the kitchen. The physical therapists came 3 times a week for exactly 1 hour each, running the boys through mechanical exercises that seemed to bring more frustration than progress. And the boys, Ethan and Lucas, spent most of their days in that playroom, surrounded by toys they couldn't reach, books no one read to them, and a silence that felt like suffocation. Grace had been raised by a mother who taught her that children were children, regardless of their abilities or challenges. In Nigeria, before Grace's father died and the money dried up, Her mother had run a small school where she'd taught children others had deemed unteachable. Grace had grown up watching her mother work miracles, not through medicine or therapy, but through attention, patience, and love. So when she was alone in the playroom, dusting or mopping, and the boys tried to talk to her, Grace began talking back. Softly at first, then more naturally. She learned that Ethan loved dinosaurs, and Lucas was fascinated by airplanes. She learned they'd never been to a park because the logistics were too complicated. She learned they went to bed at night without bedtime stories because their father was too exhausted, and the nannies considered it outside their job description. And she learned something else, something she saw in the way their legs twitched sometimes, the way their toes would curl slightly when they were excited or laughing. She'd seen it before, in Legos, in a little girl everyone said would never walk. But Grace kept her observations to herself. She was, after all, just the maid.
The incident that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late October. Grace arrived at the Bennett mansion at 7:30, as always, entering through the service entrance with her key. The nannies had called in sick, both of them, and Mr. Bennett had left a curt note on the kitchen counter. Emergency board meeting in Boston, back tomorrow evening. Boys' breakfast in fridge. Therapist arrives at 10 a.m. Grace stood in the kitchen staring at the note, then at the digital clock on the wall. It was just past 8. The boys would be waking soon, and there was no one else in the house. She should have called the agency Mr. Bennett used for emergency staff. She should have stayed in her lane, done her job, kept invisible. Instead, she walked to the boys' shared bedroom and knocked softly. "Come in," Lucas's voice called out. The boys were awake, sitting up in their respective beds, specialized medical beds that could be adjusted for their needs. They looked surprised to see her. "Where's Jennifer?" Ethan asked, referring to the morning nanny. "She's sick today," Grace said gently. "How about I help you with breakfast?" Over the next 2 hours, Grace did what she'd watched the nannies do 100 times. She transferred the boys to their wheelchairs, helped them with their morning routines, prepared their breakfast. But unlike the nannies, she talked to them while she worked. She asked them about their dreams from the night before. She told them stories about Nigeria, about the markets in Lagos where vendors sold everything from fresh fish to colorful fabrics, about the beaches where children played in the ocean. And for the first time since she'd started working at the Bennett mansion, she saw the boys truly smile. The physical therapist canceled last minute, a family emergency. Grace received the text at 9:45. She stood in the playroom, looking at Ethan and Lucas in their wheelchairs, and made a decision that would alter all their lives. "How would you two like to play a game?" she asked. What Grace did next wasn't reckless. It was based on years of watching her mother work with children, on observations she'd been making for 6 months. She'd noticed the micro-movements in the boys' legs, the way their neurological responses didn't quite match the permanence of their diagnosis. She'd heard Lucas mention once that sometimes his legs felt tingly, a detail he'd told the physical therapist, who'd dismissed it as phantom sensation. Grace had grown up too poor for assumptions. In Lagos, you questioned everything, because wrong assumptions could mean going hungry or worse. She positioned herself on the floor in front of Lucas's wheelchair and gently placed her hands on his small feet. "I'm going to move your legs a little, okay? Tell me if anything hurts." She began slowly, carefully, moving his legs through gentle ranges of motion, not the mechanical, detached exercises she'd seen the therapists perform, but movements accompanied by songs, by stories, by engagement. Lucas giggled. Ethan watched, fascinated. Then, something happened. As Grace sang a Nigerian children's song her mother had taught her, moving Lucas's left leg in rhythm with the melody, she felt resistance. Not the passive weight of paralyzed muscle, but active resistance. Lucas was pushing back against her hand. "Lucas," she said softly, her heart beginning to race. "Did you just push my hand?" The 5-year-old looked confused. I think so." Grace glanced at Ethan, then back at Lucas. "Can you try again? Push against my hand." For a long moment, nothing. Then, unmistakably, pressure against her palm. Slight, but deliberate. "Ethan, did you see that?" Lucas's voice was filled with wonder. Grace's hands trembled as she moved to Ethan's wheelchair. She repeated the process, and within minutes, Ethan showed the same response, small but undeniable muscle control that shouldn't have existed according to their diagnosis. Over the following weeks, Grace continued working with the boys in secret. She came an hour early each morning before Mr. Bennett left for work. She used her lunch breaks. She stayed late, telling Mr. Bennett she was doing deep cleaning when he occasionally came home earlier than expected. The boys were sworn to secrecy. Grace told them it was a special project they'd reveal to their father once they could surprise him. In truth, Grace was terrified. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't certified. If Mr. Bennett discovered what she was doing, she would be fired immediately and possibly prosecuted for endangering his children. But she'd seen the improvements. Ethan could now flex his toes on command. Lucas could bend his knee slightly. These weren't miracles. They were the results of consistent, patient, loving engagement that the expensive therapists, with their 1-hour sessions and clinical detachment, had never provided. Grace documented everything in a notebook she kept hidden in her bag. Dates, times, observations, progress. She'd been poor her entire life, but she wasn't uneducated. She knew she'd need evidence if this ever came to light. The breakthrough came on a Thursday in mid-November, 6 weeks after Grace had started her secret sessions. She was on the floor with both boys, all 3 of them laughing as she told them an animated story about a clever monkey who outsmarted a crocodile. The boys were on a soft mat, Grace having transferred them from their wheelchairs for what she called floor time, something the nannies never bothered with because it was too much work to lift them. And then the monkey said, Grace was mid-sentence when she saw it. Lucas, caught up in the excitement of the story, had pulled his leg inward, not much, maybe 3 inches, but he'd done it himself, without assistance, without mechanical aid. "Lucas," Grace whispered, "do that again." "Do what?" "Move your leg, the one you just moved." Lucas looked down at his legs as if seeing them for the first time, his face scrunched in concentration. And slowly, trembling with effort, his right leg moved inward again. Ethan gasped. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "I did it!" Lucas shouted. "Grace, I did it!" Grace was laughing and crying simultaneously, pulling the boys into a hug, when she heard the sound that would shatter everything. A briefcase dropping on marble floor. She turned, still on her knees, still holding the children, and saw Marcus Bennett standing in the doorway of the playroom. His face was a mask of shock, confusion, and something else, something that made Grace's blood run cold. Rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my children?"
Grace released the boys and rose to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to bow her head, to make herself small and invisible the way she'd learned to survive in white spaces. But when she looked at Ethan and Lucas, at the fear and confusion on their faces, at the legs that had just moved for the first time in their lives, something inside her refused to shrink. "Mr. Bennett," she began, but he cut her off immediately. "I asked you a question." He strode into the room, his 6'2" frame seeming to fill the entire space. His finger jabbed toward the boys. "Why are they on the floor? Where are their wheelchairs? And why the hell were you—" He stopped, his face contorting. "Were you making them move their legs?" "Mr. Bennett, please let me explain." "Explain? Explain?" His voice rose to a shout. "Do you have any idea what you could have done to them? These children have a serious medical condition. They're paralyzed, and I catch you, a maid, manipulating their bodies like you're some kind of doctor? Daddy, she wasn't hurting us." Lucas tried to interject. Quiet! Marcus's face was red now, a vein pulsing at his temple. Go to your room, both of you, now! But Daddy, now! Grace felt something break inside her as she watched the boys' faces crumple. Ethan was crying openly. Lucas looked between his father and Grace with the expression of someone watching their world collapse. I'll take them, Grace said quietly. You won't touch them again, Marcus snarled. He pulled out his phone. Margaret, get to the house immediately. Yes, right now. I don't care about your schedule. My children have been, he paused, looking at Grace with disgust, compromised. The next 20 minutes were a blur of humiliation. The nanny, Margaret, arrived and transferred the boys to their wheelchairs with efficient coldness, wheeling them out while they cried for Grace. Marcus made Grace stand in the corner of the playroom, actually ordered her to stand there like a child being punished, while he called his lawyer, his doctor, the head of the domestic agency that had placed her. Grace stood there, hands clasped in front of her, and listened to him describe her as reckless, dangerous, and criminally negligent. She heard him tell his lawyer he wanted her prosecuted for child endangerment. She heard him tell the agency he'd never hire from them again because they sent him someone who overstepped her position so grotesquely. Not once did he ask what she'd been doing. Not once did he ask about the notebook in her bag with 6 weeks of careful observations. Not once did he look at her as anything other than the help who'd forgotten her place. When he finally turned to face her, his eyes were cold. I've called the police, he said flatly. They'll be here in 10 minutes to escort you off my property. I want you to understand something very clearly. You will never work in this industry again. I will personally ensure that every family in Greenwich, in Fairfield County, in this entire state knows what you did. You're finished. Grace felt the words land like physical blows. $843 in her bank account. No job. No references. A police report that would follow her for the rest of her life. Her mother, still in Lagos, still waiting for the money Grace had promised to send for her visa application. Everything she'd worked for, gone. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Bennett, Grace heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. But I'm not sorry for what I did. His eyes widened. Excuse me? Your son's made progress today. Real, measurable progress. Lucas moved his leg, on his own, for the first time in 5 years. That's impossible. You're delusional. Am I? Grace reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook, holding it up. I've documented everything, every session, every tiny improvement, every response that their regular therapists missed because they were too busy checking their phones. Marcus stared at the notebook, then at Grace, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face, uncertainty, perhaps even doubt. But then his jaw set and the walls went back up. Give me that, he demanded, reaching for the notebook. No. That's my property. You created it in my home on my time. This is documentation of medical observations that might help your children. You can have it after you hear me out. They stood there, locked in a battle of wills, a black woman in a maid's uniform facing down a white billionaire in a $2,000 suit. Then they heard the sirens approaching outside.
The police arrived. 2 officers, both white, both male. Grace watched Marcus Bennett explain the situation, his voice reasonable and concerned, every inch the worried father protecting his disabled children from incompetent help. She watched the officers nod sympathetically, watched their body language shift from neutral to suspicious as they turned to face her. She knew this dance. She'd seen it performed her entire life. Ma'am, the older officer said, Mr. Bennett says you've been conducting unauthorized physical therapy on his children. Before Grace could answer, a voice cut through the tension. That's not what happened. Everyone turned. Lucas was standing in the doorway, not in his wheelchair, but standing, gripping the doorframe with both hands, his legs shaking with effort but holding his weight. Lucas! Marcus lunged forward, but Grace shot out her hand. Don't, she said firmly. Let him stand. He earned it. The room fell silent, except for Lucas's labored breathing. Ethan appeared behind him in his wheelchair, his face glowing with pride for his brother. Grace didn't hurt us, Daddy, Lucas said, his voice trembling but determined. She helped us, for weeks, every day.
She sang to us and played with us and made us try things the other therapists said we couldn't do. And look." His face scrunched with concentration, and his right leg lifted slightly off the ground. Only an inch, only for a second, but unmistakably, undeniably, it lifted. Marcus Bennett's face went through a series of transformations: shock, disbelief, hope, fear, and finally something that looked like pain. He dropped to his knees in front of his son, tears streaming down his face, reaching out to steady him. "How?" he whispered. Grace stepped forward, her voice gentle now. "He was never completely paralyzed, Mr. Bennett. Neither of them was. The neurological pathways were damaged, but not destroyed. They needed consistent engagement, patient encouragement, and someone who believed they could improve. I didn't perform magic. I just saw them as children with potential, not patients with limitations." The police officers looked at each other, clearly out of their depth. The older one cleared his throat. Mr. Bennett, do you still want us to—" Marcus shook his head, unable to speak, still holding Lucas. Grace watched him realize what she'd been trying to tell him, that his money, his connections, his expensive specialists had all missed what a Nigerian maid with no formal training had seen. And more than that, she watched him realize why. Because Grace had looked at his sons and seen children, not diagnoses, not limitations, not symbols of his own failure and grief over his wife's death. Just two little boys who needed someone to believe in them. When Marcus finally stood, helping Lucas back into his wheelchair, his face was different, humbler, broken open. "Officers," he said quietly, "there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Okafor she was helping my children. I'm sorry for wasting your time." After the police left, Marcus and Grace stood in the playroom, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. "I should have listened," he said finally. "Before I called everyone, before I assumed, I should have just listened." Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, you should have." "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me before you started working with them? Would you have believed me, Mr. Bennett, if I'd come to you 6 weeks ago and said I thought your sons could improve, that the diagnosis might not be complete? Would you have listened to a Nigerian maid challenging your white doctors?" The silence was her answer. Marcus looked at the notebook Grace still held. "May I see it now?" She handed it to him. He spent 10 minutes reading, his expression shifting from page to page. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "This is extraordinary work. You've documented things their therapists never noticed. You've created a whole program." He paused. "I want to hire you, not as a maid, but as their caregiver, their physical therapist. I'll sponsor whatever training or certification you need. Name your salary." Grace felt the offer land like a lifeline, except she recognized it for what it was: guilt, compensation, his way of making himself feel better. "No," she said softly. "No? I don't want to be hired to do what I should have never had to do in secret. I want you to take this notebook to your son's doctors. I want you to advocate for them the way I did. I want you to see them as children with potential, not problems to be solved. And then," she picked up her bag, "then I want a reference letter that tells the truth about what happened here so I can find another job without a police report following me." Marcus nodded slowly. "And your mother in Nigeria?" Grace's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I overheard you talking to the boys about her." He pulled out his phone. "Consider her visa application sponsored. It's the least I can do." 3 months later, Grace's mother arrived in New York. Grace had found a new job through a glowing reference from Marcus Bennett, working with a family whose daughter had cerebral palsy. The pay was triple what she'd made before, and the family treated her as a valued professional. She heard through Margaret, who'd kept in touch, that Ethan and Lucas were both in intensive physical therapy now, with doctors who'd adjusted their diagnosis and treatment plan based on Grace's observations. Lucas was taking steps with assistance. Ethan could stand for several minutes at a time. None of the news articles about their miraculous recovery mentioned Grace's name. She didn't mind. She'd learned long ago that recognition wasn't why you did the work. You did it because children deserve to be seen, to be believed in, to be given chances, regardless of who was watching or who got credit. But sometimes late at night, she thought about that moment when Marcus Bennett had looked at her in a maid's uniform and seen only incompetence, only danger, only someone who'd overstepped. And she thought about how many talented, capable, brilliant black people had been dismissed, ignored, or destroyed because someone in power couldn't see past their assumptions. How many discoveries had been lost? How many children hadn't been helped? How many dreams had died in the gap between what someone is and what others assumed they must be? Grace Okafor's story isn't unique. It's happening right now in homes, in hospitals, and in schools across the world. Someone is being judged not by their abilities, but by the color of their skin, the position they hold, the accent they speak with. Someone is being silenced when they should be heard. How many more children need to struggle? How many more Grace Okafors need to work in secret before we start seeing people clearly? Share this story if you believe everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, and tell us in the comments about a time someone underestimated you or someone you know. Let's keep the conversation going because change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with stories like this one.